It was an ordinary night at St. Gabriel Medical Center in Chicago. The halls were silent, echoing with the faint hum of machines and the soft squeak of a janitor's cart. Marcus, a 24-year-old janitor, was finishing his midnight shift when he heard something. A faint, heartbroken cry from the transplant wing. He didn't know who was behind that hospital door. He didn't know she was a powerful CEO, alone and fighting for her life. All he knew was that someone needed help, and in that single moment, Marcus made a choice that would change 2 lives forever. He offered a piece of himself, never expecting anything in return. But destiny had a strange plan, because the woman he saved wasn't just anyone. She was the lonely millionaire whose company built the hospital he cleaned every night. This is the incredible story of a janitor's kindness, a life-saving gift, and a bond that proved humanity is worth more than fortune. Marcus Alvarez clocked in at midnight. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and brewed coffee. At 24, he'd worked nights sweeping corridors and emptying bins at St. Gabriel Medical Center for 3 years. He lived in a modest apartment above a bodega on the south side, paid split rent with his younger sister Rosa, and paid student loans from a semester of community college he couldn't finish. The night shift brought its own rhythms, beeps, hushed conversations, carts rolling. Marcus liked the small comforts, the janitor's closet with its single bulb, the way fluorescent light made everything honest. That night a sound pulled him away from the supply closet. Low, raw crying coming from the transplant wing. He followed the noise to a corridor where a nurse sat, rubbing her temples, and a family huddled with clasped hands. A board outside read organ transplant, patient in critical need. Marcus overheard that a compatible donor had backed out. Without thinking, a thought settled in him. If I could help. He had no medical background, only a gut that had never let him walk away when someone needed aid. Marcus had his own reasons to act. He remembered his abuela's face when she'd need help years ago, and no one answered the door. He'd learned to value small moral certainties. The hospital's donor coordinator, a brisk woman named Jenna, explained the process slowly. Marcus listened. He learned about blood types, tissue matches, tests, risks, and recovery time. He learned he could potentially save a life. He also learned about consent forms, counseling sessions, and mandatory waiting periods. Each bureaucratic step felt intimidating and real. Marcus's family was cautious. Rosa cried when he told her. She worried about bills, about him getting hurt. Their mother had died when Marcus was 16. Their father had long vanished into another life in phone calls that never came. Marcus explained that he'd saved most of his tips and would manage. He promised to keep working if the doctors cleared him. The hospital's social worker arranged free post-op care and temporary support. Marcus was not seeking recognition. He wanted to do what was right, one life for another. Tests came back positive. Marcus's blood type matched the patient, and he was otherwise healthy. He completed physical exams, imaging, psychological interviews, and counseled with transplant surgeons. Dr. Sarah Patel, the lead transplant surgeon, explained surgical risks and recovery realities directly. Marcus heard clinical detail without flinching. He signed consent paperwork with a steady hand. The hospital scheduled surgery. For Marcus, the weeks before the operation were a mixture of mundane cleaning shifts and nights of reading about recovery stories online. He felt oddly calm, as if the world had conferred a meaning on him. On the morning of the surgery, the hospital's glass atrium caught sun and made patterns on the floor. Marcus rode in a gurney through corridors he'd swept 1,000 times. Nurses he knew from routine interactions called him by name, surprised and proud. Marcus felt the support of tiny gestures, a fist bump from a night nurse, a bouquet from a coworker pool. He thought of Rosa's laugh and the smell of tamales his abuela used to steam. In the sterile pre-op room, he closed his eyes and told himself it was the right thing. No one forced him. He'd chosen. The operation stretched through hours. In the OR, there was a steady choreography of voices and hands. Masks, monitors, the metallic ring of instruments. Dr. Patel worked with a team that moved like a single organism. Marcus woke to a soft light and vague beeps, feeling hollow where one organ used to be, and grateful for the surgeon's skill. Nurses told him the patient was stable. Sedation left him hazy and reflective. Later, his chest and flank ached. He slept between morphine waves and whispered thanks to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. Recovery was slower than he expected. Pain arrived in punctual waves and simple tasks. Sitting up, walking to the bathroom, climbing stairs. Took concentration. The hospital physical therapist, a patient man named Keith, worked with Marcus on small milestones, 30 steps, then 60. Marcus used sick leave and a short donor recovery fund to cover lost wages for a few weeks. The hospital provided food vouchers and counseling. Friends from the janitorial team visited with jokes to distract him. Marcus's sister Rosa slept in an armchair beside his bed and read aloud to keep his spirits strong. Marcus had imagined the day after surgery as quiet closure. Instead, someone told him the patient had stabilized and that media teams might be interested. He had meant to be anonymous, an act of private kindness. Marcus pushed away the idea of cameras and headlines. He wanted to heal and return to work. Yet he couldn't ignore an unexpected swell of emotion when nurses told him the patient had woken and asked about their donor. Marcus felt an oddness, intimacy without introductions. He had given a piece of himself to an unknown person, whose life now continued because of him. The hospital's social services coordinated donor follow-ups and legal documentation of his release. Marcus did paperwork and watched a video about post-op care. He felt proud and tired. Friends on the floor clapped when he took his first cautious walk down a corridor. The small pleasures of normality returned: the janitor's cart, the smell of lemon cleaner, the way fluorescent lights hummed after midnight. Yet behind every sweep his mind returned to a single question: who had he helped? He wanted to know, not out of curiosity, but to make sure the life he'd given up a kidney for would be treated with care. A week after discharge, Marcus received a clipped message from the transplant office. The patient wanted to meet donor volunteers in a controlled setting. Marcus felt the world narrow into a single day. He arrived at the hospital dressed in a shirt he'd ironed, palms sweaty. The meeting room looked like a neutral ground: soft chairs, a pot of coffee, a board with flowers. Marcus sat across from a woman whose eyes looked exhausted and immediately familiar because of the hospital ID bracelet. He didn't know yet that she was wealthier than anyone he'd ever served coffee to. The woman introduced herself in a voice that was cautious and precise. "I'm Evelyn Hartwell." Marcus noticed her hands, steady, manicured, the hands of someone who'd negotiated contracts, not bandages. He learned she was 42, a CEO who'd built a health tech company and retreated into privacy when illness hit. She looked at Marcus with gratitude that made him uncomfortable. Evelyn's voice cracked when she tried to say thank you. Marcus mumbled that he didn't need thanks. It felt strange to be the center of attention. He'd always preferred the background. Reporters later called the story a miracle match, a humble janitor who saved a billionaire CEO. Marcus disliked the word miracle. He thought instead about choices and small mercies. Hospitals were the same whether you paid your bills or had someone else pay them. The difference Marcus saw was that privilege offered options Evelyn hadn't needed before illness stripped them away. For Marcus, the work ahead was practical: heal, return to his sister, handle bills, and maybe finish community college. For Evelyn, the work was more complicated: relearning how to ask for help and let people in. That night, Marcus returned to his modest apartment and sat on the sofa with a heating pad and a bowl of soup Rosa had made. He thought about what he'd done and what it meant. The act of donation had not changed his bank account or his address, but it had changed the way strangers looked at him, and more importantly, the way he saw himself. He felt both vulnerable and stronger. Marcus had offered the most literal form of empathy, a piece of himself, and in return he received a new kind of dignity, the knowledge that he'd acted from his truest self. Evelyn Hartwell woke slowly. She had lived years in conference rooms and glass towers, in a life built on schedules and projections. At 42, she had learned to delegate heartbreak, to schedule grief into manageable blocks. When she first felt wrong with her body, it began as a fog in her limbs, and then the tests that became verdicts. Her company, Hartwell Biosystems, had built a fortune-selling diagnostic algorithms. Irony felt small and bitter. In the hospital, stripped of titles, she listened to machines with the same analytic attention she applied to quarterly reports. The transplant left her weak but alive. In recovery, the first thing she asked for wasn't coffee or her phone. It was a name. Who is the donor? She had imagined donors in sanitized portraits, altruistic strangers, volunteers who wrote essays. She hadn't imagined the possibility of a young man who mopped floors in the same building. When the transplant team told her the donor was an employee of St. Gabriel, a janitor called Marcus, she felt a tangle of emotions: shame, gratitude, curiosity, and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: humility. Evelyn had been accustomed to controlling outcomes. She made strategic decisions and expected systems to respond. Illness rewired that assumption. Here, survival required another person's willingness to bear risk. She found the dependence unfamiliar and strangely humbling. Staffers told her the donor had refused payment, and asked for no publicity. Evelyn's first inclination was to honor the request. The second was a CEO's instinct, to say thank you in a way that mattered. Inside her penthouse, surrounded by objects that meant accomplishment, a new value surfaced: human connection. Reporters began to circle even before Evelyn left the hospital. Her PR team prepared statements and arranged a controlled meeting with the donor, framing it as a private expression of gratitude rather than a spectacle. Evelyn agreed to meet Marcus because she wanted to speak directly to the person who'd given her life. She feared the performative gratitude common to her world, trophies and plaques, and instead sought something real. The conversation she imagined was simple: thank you, a handshake, and then a return to separate lives. She didn't plan for the awkward intimacy that would follow. At the hospital, Evelyn met Marcus in the white meeting room. He looked younger than she'd expected, thinner from recovery but steady-eyed. He spoke with a candor that disarmed her. Marcus explained, without self-pity, why he'd volunteered: a mixture of moral impulse and a memory of someone in need he couldn't leave. Evelyn listened, feeling the words settle like small stones. She offered money at first, an instinct, and watched Marcus decline with dignity and a clear boundary. He did not want charity. This refusal made Evelyn confront her own assumptions about power and help. Evelyn decided to do something different. If Marcus would not take charity, perhaps she could create opportunity. She arranged for a discreet scholarship fund in Marcus's name to finish: community college and a paid apprenticeship in Hartwell, Biosystems Facilities Maintenance Department, that came with a training pathway into technician certification. She hired a private counselor to help Marcus through recovery and offered to cover temporary household expenses while he healed. Evelyn's offers were practical and meant to respect Marcus's agency while giving him lasting change. The board at Hartwell Biosystems had mixed feelings. Some executives praised Evelyn's generosity as smart philanthropy that aligned with corporate social responsibility. Others worried about optics, a story with potential backlash. Evelyn moved carefully, insisting the measures be long-term and dignity-preserving. She refused public fanfare. Internally, she set guidelines. Apprenticeship should be paid and include options for advancement. Scholarship funds would be administered by a community nonprofit chosen by Marcus. Her decisions reflected a change in how she conceived value, less about leverage and more about repair. Marcus accepted Evelyn's offer after a week, not because he wanted to be indebted to someone with wealth, but because the path offered a way forward he could own. The apprenticeship placed him near engineering teams and sterile labs, spaces he'd only cleaned. Training instructors, including a kindly technician named Maria, age 36, female, taught him real skills: HVAC basics, safety compliance, and the language of industrial maintenance. Marcus surprised himself by enjoying systematic troubleshooting. He found creativity in practical solutions and began to imagine a life beyond janitorial night shifts. Evelyn observed quietly from a distance. She visited Marcus at work once, bringing coffee and a respectful note rather than a check. Those small visits became a bridge between two disparate worlds. Marcus introduced Evelyn to colleagues who treated him with fresh respect not because of wealth, but because of competence. Evelyn, in turn, allowed herself to be visible in small human ways, admitting fear, asking about Marcus's family, and telling him about a childhood when she'd loved painting before profit plans overtook her life. They learned how reciprocal dignity could be. Public interest evolved into narrative complexity. Local news initially framed the event as a class story, then moved toward profiles about unexpected friendship and corporate responsibility. Marcus gained some attention, but he was careful to keep focus on his recovery and studies. He posted occasional photos with colleagues and thanked the hospital staff. Evelyn used her platform to highlight organ donation awareness rather than focusing on herself. She backed a public campaign with local hospitals to increase donor registration, leveraging Hartwell Biosystems' analytics team to target outreach in under-registered communities. The months that followed brought both practical outcomes and emotional growth. Marcus completed technician certifications and enrolled in community college classes during evenings. He and Rosa moved into a slightly larger apartment near transit. Rosa found a steady job in a daycare. Marcus's confidence grew, and he used his story to speak modestly at community centers about health, choices, and dignity. For Evelyn, the changes were quieter but profound. She reinstated a company policy to expand entry pathways into technical roles for local residents and created a staff fund for emergency medical aid. Challenges persisted. Marcus had scars and the occasional fatigue, Evelyn faced follow-up visits and a surveillance schedule that kept vulnerability present. They both navigated questions about boundaries. Marcus did not want to be tokenized. Evelyn did not want to buy friendship. They had arguments about publicity, about how much of their private lives to share for advocacy. Yet those conflicts strengthened rather than weakened what formed between them. They discovered that honest negotiation about power and need could build trust more durable than sentiment. One autumn evening, Marcus and Evelyn volunteered at a donor awareness fair together. They sat behind a table with pamphlets and registration forms. People came with questions, fears about donation, myths, concerns about costs. Marcus told his story plainly. Evelyn talked about policy changes and how lived experience informed leadership. The crowd listened. A teenage boy asked Marcus whether he'd do it again. Marcus answered without hesitation that he would. The message was simple but potent. A life saved had ripple effects that could shift institutions and expectations. By the time a year had passed, both had altered trajectories. Marcus had a steady income, enrolled in technical courses, and a new sense of selfhood. Not merely as a janitor, but as someone with agency and options. Evelyn had reoriented parts of her life to consider social impact more intimately and allowed relationships to enter spaces she'd kept glassy and sealed. They didn't become family in a fairy tale sense, but they created a friendship compressed with mutual respect, the kind that changes the way two people move through the world.